economy.
He'll reportedly vow to stand by hardworking families and help with the escalating cost of living crisis. Many are hoping for a cut to fuel duty and a delay to the rise in national insurance.
But after his unprecedented financial support for many during the pandemic, there are questions over how far Rishi Sunak will go in this statement, despite pressure to spend and borrow more.
In his autumn budget last year, he made clear that his intention going forward would be to balance the books and cut taxes in the future. But his tenure as Chancellor so far has been defined by massive spending and taxes at the highest level for 70 years.
Well, to take us through what to expect in that statement in the House of Commons later today is the Head of Research and Analysis at Exchequer, Andrew Sachs. Good morning to you. Welcome back to the programme. Look, there's been this windfall for the Prime Minister. I just take an example of the front of the FT. Sunak to lay aside windfall cash rather than helping households. Now, a lot of people are already critical of him pushing for a national insurance hike when we're already facing a cost of living crisis. Given that they're getting this revenue from tax receipts, is this a bad decision?
I think it could potentially be one that loses votes, especially when you consider that the actual less vocal voices within the Conservative government have actually quite often said to him that this is not really a vote winner and they are against these particular measures. This has happened before. So what we have now is a position where you have, as you rightly say, the individual members of the public being potentially hit by a national insurance rise, which is very expensive if you think about it. If you've got people, especially in London, actually one particular commentator, market analyst this morning said London will probably be hit the highest by these things because in London, if you have an average salary of, say, 60,000, 70,000, that's the kind of people are just getting by on that. And therefore
But you can't have it every way, Andrew. This is paying for the health service and the social care service that people say they want, and that has to be paid for.
It does indeed, absolutely right. And I think it's a question of looking at how to... Exactly as you rightly said earlier, this particular Chancellor has a reputation in the eye of the public. Whether it's right or wrong is something, but the reputation is that he has spent and taxed. So what you've got here is a black hole of £11 billion where over the last 2 years, the furlough scheme, Rishi Sunak's furlough scheme, some of that was misappropriated and it was never been claimed back. So Companies House are now looking at how to... there's a lot of companies being struck off the register, being voluntarily struck off the register at the moment. Companies House is blocking those. I spoke to Companies House last week and they are blocking quite a few applications to strike off companies because they're pending an inspection as to whether they spent what they spent the money on, basically.
Yes, whether they make fraudulent claims.
That's right, fraudulent claims on the furlough scheme and on the bounce-back loan schemes.
Yes. So
some of them are under investigation for that. And there isn't really much recourse over it. So what perhaps they could do, I mean, it's not really for me to say, but let's say what they could do is potentially try to keep the markets flowing and the retail side of things by keeping the public able to afford certain things and then look to recuperate some of that particular cash. 11 billion, it would go quite a long way to bridge that gap, I suppose.
So they would get that back through people spending money and paying income tax and getting VAT returns and things. So it just keeps the economy...
Keep the economy turning over. Exactly.
Right.
So, Andrew, just explain the role in inflation in all of the announcements today, because we already talked a little bit about how that's boosting number 11 in terms of its revenue from tax, but is also increasing the amount it's having to pay in these interest debt repayments that they've incurred throughout the pandemic. So it's sort of giving with one hand, taking with the other.
It is, and that was inevitable, I suppose. That anyone really with a forecasting mind would have seen that the 2 years of paying out a lot of what appeared to be relatively free money and keeping the economy going based on paying people to stay at home and giving companies loans which were backed by the state, eventually somebody's going to have to pay for that because the economy was really down to a very low level 2 years ago and brought down very quickly to that. Someone's going to have to pay for it. So the inflation started to creep up over the course of that period. Some American commentators have been saying that the US government is putting out figures of, say, 6-7% inflation, highest in 30 years. But really, when you go down deeper, it could be already double figures.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Shocking, yeah.
So this is really getting towards, we spoke about this before, getting towards the 1991 levels of high inflation. So, of course, there's then wage inflation. And the wage inflation is something that's being looked at right now. This is where economists are looking at wage inflation and the effect that will have on people having to pay those extra tax and NI increases.
But basically, he's got a problem where the future is uncertain. Whether it is inflation, whether it's the Ukraine war, whether it's the return of a pandemic. So when we look at that headline in the Financial Times, he's basically saying, I'm going to have to keep something in reserve because things could get a whole lot worse.
Absolutely right. And that, I think, is something that's been criticised, and quite rightly, on many Western economies have been built on a debt-based model over the last few years. So the debt-based model is that the majority of businesses and private individuals use their income to service some form of debt, like a mortgage, or companies borrow and they use financing for things and they service debt, which means that hasn't borne in mind that there could potentially be something where some reserves need to be kept aside. It's very easy to break a bank when it's like that.
Yeah, and look, we're not asking you for political views because you come in as a financial expert, but a lot of political commentators are suggesting that he's keeping the little war chest for the next election to try and help, look good just before people go to the ballot box. Look, I want to ask, and I won't press you on that, but on fuel duty, we're expecting this cut of around 5 pence per litre. Do you think that's going to go far enough? And we only have to look to, say, Ireland. They're talking about, in Ireland, it's 17 pence per litre on petrol, 13 pence per litre on diesel. Yeah. And in France, it's 13 pence a litre for the next 4 months. We're only doing 5 pence. Why?
That's right. And it's already very expensive now. I mean, you can see there is no reduction of traffic on the roads because obviously people need to go about their everyday business. But there are a lot of dissenting voices. It's very expensive. The fuel for your car and the fuel to heat or cool your home or office is now a big talking point. Yeah. So these energy companies, Rishi Sunak was talking about making a windfall tax for energy companies profiteering on the back of this. But the difficulty with that is that it's almost gone down to a monopolistic situation where 30-something energy companies went out of the market at the end of last year, leaving it down to a few, which are also hit by supply chain and having to pay a lot for the raw commodities. Now, oil is up to almost $120 a barrel right now, which is really high, and other raw materials, because now, if you look at Europe, 40% of the raw materials base came from Russia, so you have now the sanctions which have left a hole in the market, so they've had to pay extra for that from other suppliers. So the question is, are those few energy companies left actually making any profit because they're having to pay a lot for the raw materials and the logistics in the first place? Or if they are making a profit, will they decide to move their registered office to the Cayman Islands or something like that and avoid that in the first place, which means that nobody actually makes anything from that revenue.
Yes.
I'm getting the impression that maybe nobody will be satisfied by, come 5 o'clock or so today.
That's possible. And actually, this tax with the fuel tax situation, if you've got 5p less, already I read a report yesterday that the government is talking about taking cars off the road on Sunday. I don't know if did you see that?
Yeah, saw that, yeah.
So they're talking about sort of lockdowns in a way, if you think about it, by removing vehicles on a Sunday. So even if you can pay for the fuel, you won't be allowed.
Nowhere to go.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
okay. Look, really appreciate that, Andrew. Always a fascinating insight, and have a good mini statement day, budget day, whatever it turns out to be.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. That was Andrew Sachs, Head of Research and Analysis at